That Stephen earlier on spoke to the Women Forward Party representative about what their party is about and where we are generally in South African politics in terms of women representation. We are in the studio now with Professor Angelo Fick, who is political analyst, and later on we hope to get another person on the line to break it down for us. But perhaps let me start with just in the most clinical way of understanding. There's representativity, which is used as a tool, I suppose, to measure whether or not there's equity or equality. And can we really talk about also equity being mere equality?
So let me get this out of the way. I'm not a professor before that gets, kind of out of control in this country.
That, are you?
No, I'm not. So in response to your question, I think there needs to be a distinction between having the numbers in Parliament, which is certainly important, so having women in equal representation or in representation that kind of reflects their numbers as the majority in this country, and policies that are pro-woman and feminist policies, because those are three very different sorts of things. And I think people like Shireen Hassim, people like Susan Batzili, people like Dorothy Driver, Desiree Lewis, Pumla Gola have all written about these sorts of issues. And so I think it is important that there be enough women in Parliament to reflect women in South Africa. But beyond that, we need to have an agenda that also sets women's politics on the agenda as central to all policy making, as your previous guest pointed out. And I do believe that Ms. Lebohang Pheko is now on the line with us to share her views on this particular issue. So, Ms. Pheko, I was asking Angelo here whether or not we should distinguish just in terms of representativity and equality, and from a very clinical level. Perhaps you'd like to mention also diversity in South African politics.
Thanks. So I think I agree quite with what I heard Angelo talking about, because there's a huge difference between substantive participation and the politics of presence. And I think what has happened often is that the politics of presence have become a proxy for a transformative agenda, and the two aren't the same. Being present in a conversation isn't quite the same, and what elections should represent is a diverse menu of our collective aspirations. And what voters want to see when they vote, ideally, is to see ourselves. And we have the transaction of power between political parties and voters is getting a bit lost, and it's become a case of political parties almost using voters as fodder, merely as fodder to ensure that they enable themselves to accumulate or aggregate sufficient numbers to then access power and the resources and the privileges that come alongside that power, rather than understanding that this power is really a transactional relationship and actually a contract, a social compact between themselves and the voters. And this would mean then, of course, understanding that voters are voting for you because you've got a particular view on the ecology, on the environment, and so on the economy. And the problem with particularly the politics of presence in relation to women in power or women in parliament is, again, that it's become a really cheap numbers game. And it's not about substantively shifting conversations from one to the next. And I think that's really become really problematic.
Angela, one of the things that Ms. Gumeto was speaking earlier on about is the fact that the term women becoming a synonym for sex and representativity in terms of sexuality as well. So you have a lot of these political parties that have addressed those issues in their manifestos, and you've got high numbers in terms of the people in the total number of candidates. How reflective are they there on these issues that we're highlighting?
So the IEC itself has done work on intra-party democracy in terms of what happens inside a party. And so this idea of democratizing gender inside a party is quite interesting. So if you look at the parties, and in terms of even just the numbers game, so let's not pretend the numbers game is the whole game, but just in terms of the number of candidates that are women and the number of candidates who are men, that's not necessarily reflexive of the South African population. And many parties defend this as part of, it's just the process on the ground, it's what people want. But we live in a constitutional democracy where it is also our duty to ensure equality for women And as a political party, that equality has to be ensured inside the party before you can even begin to suggest that your policies will address it in government. And we know that even in the governing party, during their elective conference in 2017, the top 10 officials, the top 6 officials, there was a whole concern around gender equity there, and the Women's League of the African National Congress expressing its, shall we say, disappointment at the outcomes of that elective conference. And so it's not just about what happens at the point of electoral lists having to be drawn up, but what happens in the 5 years between those lists inside these parties, and these parties' accountability to communities, and what policies they drive that affect women's equality across the board in communities across the country, not just in parliament, not just in provincial legislatures.
So, Lebohang, just looking at South African society and the parties that are represented there, I'm looking at the South African National Congress or traditional authorities there, people who say that there hasn't been much change if you look at certain rural settings as well. If you look at a party that is the South African Maintenance and Estate Beneficiaries Association, are they going to be in positions to fight on behalf of women who have those issues, being discriminated on the basis of gender because they're unable to bring their partners to book, failing in their responsibilities in the property rights section, etc.?
Okay, so if I've understood your question correctly, is really asking whether particularly overtly, patriarchal societies, such as in rural areas, whether they're able to represent women's concerns appropriately. The answer would be definitely not. It would be almost impossible for a predominantly masculinist bias to work in the interest of women, because power privilege is extremely comfortable. So it wouldn't be in its interest, in their interest, of course, to cede this power. But of course, the other point I'd like to pick up on is exactly that internal culture is a reflection. Internal party culture is often a reflection of, says far more, and the composition of the conversations, the debates, says a lot more than the manifesto says, and it reflects obviously the ethos and the sense in which, of course, it's a reflection of the way that people, it's the dining room talk, the kitchen talk, and if parties internally are not able to pick up on the fact that they have to lead by example and actually be incredibly self-interrogating and self-critical and self-aware. This is bound to leak out into policy-making frameworks, and it's going to continue. We're going to continue to see women being treated as an addendum. So you get a 30-page manifesto which says at the bottom, and of course, this is all to do with gender and with a gender bias and with a gender lens and all of this kind of thing. If the internal culture is inherently rotten, if the apple is rotten inside, nothing else is going to work very well. Nothing else is going to function. And this is really about a societal and a psychological shift, which the numbers and the fancy manifestos are not able to really reflect appropriately.
So, Angelo, that's the point that I was making, that if you look at parties like, for instance, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, the Good Party, some of these parties have an equal number of women and men in the top 10 candidates list. But if you look at established parties such as the ANC, so the people that you profess to represent in achieving freedom, equality, etc., and the Democratic Alliance, their policies and how they've done a back and forth on BEE, do they really speak to the conditions on the ground and their ability to change the atmosphere for women who face some of these challenges?
So for somebody like me who has been taught to bring a feminist lens to any kind of analysis for the last 29 years, these parties obviously are not doing the same thing. They're using, as Lebohang pointed out, gender as an addendum, as an add-on. And so this is really deeply concerning, because in a party like the African National Congress, we have much that is in our constitution, many of those institutions that are meant to ensure gender equity. The Commission for Gender Equity is the consequence of agitation inside the African National Congress in the 1990s and 1980s to bring gender more centrally to the agenda. I think we have spent a period in which it has dropped off, in which it has been assumed that once you've got the institutions, you will effect the kinds of issues that you have. But in the most unequal society in the world, inequality and poverty have the face of femininity. And we cannot pretend that a party that has overseen governance in that period where this has happened isn't in itself internally responsible for some of those issues. This is not just that outsiders have done this. So when you look at these parties, it's not that we should have an either or. There shouldn't be either you have equal representation in the leadership or you have equal representation across the party. It should be both and. It's not either you have this representation or you have women's issues centered on whether it's land policy, poverty, urban safety, housing. All of that should be present. It shouldn't be that, oh, rural women and land is an issue, but we can think about economic opportunity outside of a lens that focuses on women's empowerment. It's all policy ought to have women as central to that policy because, one, women are the majority, two, women have been the recipients of and subjects of the most severe forms of oppression, exclusion and marginalization. So if you want to change the economy, the politics, the judiciary, it's not just a matter of either or, it's both and all of the above.
So we'll drill down to the specifics in just a moment, what South Africa has achieved. But Lebohang, I'd like to find out from you, just in terms of socio-economic development and vis-a-vis party financing. So you would find certain institutions or entities funding certain political parties because of the face of the party, the alpha male, alpha female. And I want to find out from you, how much does that influence whether party A or B, the financing, pursues some of those policies in favor of women and diversity?
Yeah, if I've understood your question properly, the idea that I think that there are two issues there. The one is that party funding and party political funding is in itself a political act, and there's been rightfully a huge amount of scrutiny in this regard in recent weeks, months, and years in this country and beyond around who funds us and why they fund us. This is incredibly important because there's often a link between the party funding and the direction of policy thereof, particularly because, a lot of the funding comes with a lot of strings attached around whether it's the condition that particular economic model should be followed, or socioeconomic patterns should then be, socioeconomic redistribution should then be abandoned. And in some cases, it also comes with interesting things around reproductive rights, which for women and as a feminist issue are quite important. And what's quite key to that is whether or not voters, if they understood where the funding was coming from, whether they would want to identify themselves with these parties. And secondly, the extent to which the skewing that you mentioned, the extent to which then this would alter the character, the characteristics, the motifs of the given political party. So, for example, if a party is given money on the condition or on the understanding that they have an explicit agenda to advance women's liberation, to advance women's political participation, if I dare say a feminist agenda, would this then mean that they would then have to rethink their own internal DNA? Would this shift the DNA of the party internally? And secondly, would this then mean that a different constituency would be attracted to them? Because as I said before, we want to see ourselves in political movements, and we've been reduced to a great extent to voting for parties who are either the least scandalous, the leaders who have the least, who have no particular scandals that come to mind, rather than really passionately identifying deeply and having a deep resonance with the political parties that are available to us at the moment.
So, Angelo, you mentioned earlier on how the South African Constitution guarantees the right of all and outlaws discrimination on the basis of sexuality, class, and gender. Looking at how much money South Africa as a country has spent, especially on infrastructure development, is there evidence of the acknowledgement of, for instance, how women are unfairly biased by how our roads are built, the proximity of medical or health institutions or schools?
Hello?
So I think this picks up on something that Lebohang Pheko earlier said. If you centralize gender and particularly women's positions and women's politics in urban planning, in health provision, then that would not be a question that you could even ask. But the fact that that question is askable tells us that in South Africa that hasn't actually happened. What has happened is that convenience, delivery, all sorts of other issues have driven the agenda of where we put services, where we put infrastructure. But how we then think of the relationship between women, childcare in this country particularly, and not only people's own children, but women who take care of children, period. Care, as one of your, Ms. Gumede indicated earlier, how that influences people's access to education, to health facilities, to transport, all of that would have to shift. Let's think of how Miriam Tladi, the novelist, wrote in the 1980s about women and safety on transport. We are now 35 years later. Has the planning of transport infrastructure taken into account the concerns women have raised for almost 50 years around safety in transport, transport and provision, transport and hours? We have shift workers. Does any of this play a role? Because if it did play a role in the planning situation, we wouldn't have to ask the add-on question after. It would have been there right at the beginning. It would have been there in the formulation of policy. It would have foregrounded the delivery of policy. Life Isidimeni tragedy would never have happened in the richest province in this country if we had had gender as a central lens and women's issues as a central lens, not because women are natural carers, but because so much of the care falls on women, and so not funding it, underfunding it, results in the kinds of tragedies that we see.
Mm-hmm. So, Angelo, I must ask you this question. We saw earlier on former President Thabo Mbeki saying that for the first time in 10 years he will be able to campaign on behalf of the governing party, the ANC, because they've done some introspection and have recognized the deviation from the core principles and values of the ANC. First of all, were you surprised by that? And do you think, secondly, women fall squarely in, that criticism of deviating from the ANC's policies?
So if one sits inside the African National Congress stable, as Thabo Mbeki has continued to do for his entire life, it is, I presume, in his case, possible to see the sea change from what he thinks of as the Zuma years to what is now the Ramaphosa years. Some of us who don't sit inside the ANC stable may not necessarily share his optimism and his particular positive view. The consequences of the Zuma years remain with South Africa, but so do the consequences of the Mbeki years and the Mandela years. We cannot simply lop off the 8 years or so of Jacob Zuma's presidency of the ANC and of the country as if that was an isolated echo chamber in which things happened, which we are now in the process of undoing. We built South Africa as we now know it over the last 25 years, and we need to take responsibility for all of those 25 years, the inequality that was built, the lack of access, the bad education system and its consequences, and those are not just the effect of the last 8 years, they're also the effect of all 25 years, and they're not just the consequences of the ANC's governance, they're also the consequences of this entire society signing up to those particular issues. And so when we start critiquing the past, it is not convenient for somebody in my position to lop off 7 or 8 years and say those are responsible for where we are now. We are where we are now partly because of those years, but also as a consequence of the years that went before that. Inequality was not built in South Africa between 2009 and 2018. Mm-hmm. It was built in South Africa from colonialism onwards, and it was intensified and reinstituted under a post-apartheid government.
Lebohang, there are those who argued that in those past 8 years you saw a higher number of women not only represented at executive level but in parliament. But if we are going to talk about collective leadership, therefore collective responsibility, can there be a differentiation made between the ANC now and the ANC 10 years ago and before that?
No, I don't think so. For the very reasons that Angelo has advanced. I mean, if a party is a unitary formation, it exists as a total and self-existing entity, and one would imagine that this entity is with all its contradictions and with all its complexity, is in some way in tandem and in coalescence, and it knows itself. I mean, people keep talking about this center that the ANC should have, and any political formation needs to have. I don't know what that center should be, but the one center and the one stream, continuous stream of consciousness, I would argue, would be at least the capacity to recognize wrongdoing and to recognize and appreciate that the pressure of incumbency is not one that comes lightly, and take responsibility where that pressure has been either too much or where there have been deliberate shortcuts or where there have been, in fact, misdemeanors, and take responsibility, in fact, even for the places and the spaces which were available to then deal with the rot, and where those spaces and places were not utilized in any particular or meaningful way. Meaning that, the ANC cannot compartmentalize itself between the good guys and the bad guys. It is a whole entity, and that includes indeed the past 25 years that Angelo has mentioned. But it also goes back to the history of it goes back further. It goes back to the formation of the ANC in 1912. It goes back also to the formation of the state, and it also goes back to the way that African states in general have been incredibly unwilling to translate liberation politics into governance politics, and also have been unwilling to take women as central to that governance.
Political Analyst Ms. Lebohang, Pheko, and Professor Angelo, Fick, apologies. Thank you very much for your time, and we're going to take a quick break.